Mi smo more krvi prolili za bratstvo i jedinstvo naših
građani. Agresija je završena. Mir je nadvladao.
Hoće gospodin Karadžić više niko, neće više niko možda u Srpsku.
Republika Hrvatska proglašuje.
Nemojte da mislite da nećete odvesti Bosnu i Hercegovinu u pakao.
Hello, dear listeners. This is Jakub Horvat from Balkan Chronicles, and we are again doing an English-speaking episode because we have an expert on Balkans with us. You know him. You have liked his episode on the protests in Serbia, which were still ongoing in August, and they are still ongoing now when we are recording this in November. But this is not why we are meeting today with Filip Ilanković. Today we are discussing a different topic, which is very important and very current, and it's concerning the Serbian energy sanctions, or more precisely the sanctions on Serbian refinery in Nis. But I would say I would leave this to our expert to explain it in much more detail. Please, Filip.
Hi, Jakub. Thank you for inviting me again. I'm looking forward to this discussion that we planned for some time now. And just at the beginning, I just want to say that, just a minor correction, it was not only against the refinery, but against the company as a whole. Because Serbian oil company NIS, it's under majority ownership of Russian firm Gazpromneft, which is actually under the US sanctions. So if we observe it through that lens, it means that Serbian oil sector is not under the sanctions directly. So it's basically between two fires. So unfortunately, a little country is in that situation. But as we can see now in the European energy sector and policy making, it's quite conflicting, because also European Union is having some moves. They're banning Russian gas imports. They're giving very short-term dates. But government of the US was, I would say, more flexible in that way. They announced that they will impose sanctions on Gazpromneft, which is not only operating in Serbia, it's also operating in some other countries, for example, some Turkey countries. It has some majority shareholding there in their companies. But what's important here in this story is Serbia, so I'll just stick to that. Basically, the whole context is that Russian company Gazpromneft bought NIS, so Serbian oil company, in 2008, which was basically previous democratic regime that ruled Serbia, and it was the era of privatization. So basically, in those years, I would like to say that everything was sold. So even what was not for selling, everything was sold. At that time, they justified this move with basically saying that NIS was in a very difficult economic situation. The economic crisis hit in 2008. Maybe we didn't have some enough experts to lead the company, and so on and so forth. And therefore we needed the help from the Russians, which are highly experienced in the energy sector. So they sold majority of the shares to the Gazpromneft for 400 million euros, which, if you observe it from today's standpoint, is pennies and is pocket money basically for big companies, and it was a bad move. But from that perspective back then, nobody could say that, for example, US and Russia relationship would be so bad in 2025. No one would say that full-scale invasion or war in Ukraine could happen in 2022. So these are some events that came more than a decade later, and it could not be predicted. So politicians back then, I would say, made very reasonable move to sell it, to give it to the Russians to basically help for the company to grow. And actually they did. So that's important to emphasize. NIS is one of the largest contributors to the Serbian GDP and to Serbian budget. So they contribute more than 10% of Serbian budget. And also NIS controls more than 70% of the Serbian domestic oil market. So it's very significant.
I believe that Serbia still has some, as in Serbian state still retains some shares in the refinery. What is the government's share company?
Yes, currently it's more than 30%. However, Russians are currently having 56%. So again, majority, and they can impose their decisions. The rest are minority shareholders, some companies, private equity holders, so on and so forth.
This is always an issue with major companies which are or were state-owned. Our listeners from Slovakia are very aware of the situation in Slovakia. The only refinery in Slovakia, Slovnaft, which was before the 1990s, it was called Apollo or Apolka, as we called it, and it was sold to MOL, a Hungarian energy conglomerate, around similar time. I think it was in 2006, and now it's 100% owned by MOL. And for example, Croatia sold its INA company to MOL around that time as well. Well, at that time the governments were interested in some quick cash. It was around the time of financial crisis, and these major strategic industries where energy was cheap. Well, they didn't think it very much through. Everything seemed too positive, and they were happy to sell it to someone experienced, some private company with better practices in running things than government. But once you give up ownership, well, it's hard or very, very expensive to get it back.
Yes.
Next to impossible.
Very much, and that's the situation where Serbia is now, actually, between the two fires, and one fire is much more hotter than the other. But what I would emphasize is that you said that they are in the ownership of MOL. Well, that helps the cause because Hungary is also an EU member, and it's very difficult to have this tense situation between the EU members, as it's now geopolitical. We have geopolitical issues on a broader level. So Russia was never expected to be a member of the European Union or in any way be so strongly connected with Europe. Yes, it always had a strong energy relationship with the European continent. It sold its cheap energy. However, these kind of things could be anticipated to some extent only because of the one reason. In my opinion, it's not wise to sell your strategically important companies, such as energy companies, because energy is a necessity like a water. So if you run out of energy, basically the whole economy shuts down, the industry shuts down. It's very difficult to survive that period. So that is why from this standpoint, and even from the standpoint of 2008, it's not a good decision to privatize such a big and meaningful company. There could be another solution, but that's alternative history now. We are not going to discuss about it. What is important now is that Gazpromneft owned 56% of the shares, and obviously with the current geopolitical tensions, the US doesn't like it, simply said. The US has officially said that the reason behind these sanctions is that they want to economically cripple the Russian warring machine in the Ukraine, which could be correct if Serbia was a $1 trillion market, but it's not. It's a really small market with only 6.5 million inhabitants, and being outside of an EU state and such a small state, it's not relevant economically speaking, even for Gazpromneft. Just to put it in a perspective, of the entire Gazpromneft revenue for 1 year, Serbia makes only 1%. So Serbian market is actually NIS. So it's very much neglectable, and this official reason stated by the US Treasury Department back then in January is not, suitable. It's not true. What I would say is that the real reason behind it is to push any Russian influence out of the European continent. So it's either to completely eradicate it or to lower it to the bare minimum. Right now, the only industry in Serbia where Russia has a strong footprint and strong control is energy sector. So basically, Chinese have much more influence, for example, in investing in Serbia, for example, in infrastructure or in mining industry. But if you observe energy industry, so oil and gas, Russia is the biggest player. As concerning oil, they only have a role playing in NIS as a company, as an owner of the company, basically, majority owner. So they can impose decisions. However, NIS a long time ago diversified its oil supply, and basically all of the oil basically that is important comes from JANAF, which is Croatian oil pipeline coming from Adriatic Sea. And the majority of the oil imported there is of Iraqi origin. So it's not Russian origin. We cannot say that, Serbia is reliant on Russian cheap oil. It's not true. However, what is true is that Serbia imports much of the Russian gas and has Russian gas infrastructure in its energy sector. So it's very much dependent on that. And it's very much important in this conversation as well, because it influences some decisions of some decision makers that can be made in the future, but probably they won't, because they're a last resort that could be used to tackle this issue.
Yes, and as you said, the important thing is Serbia is not EU member state, and for them to diversify their gas supply to power up their power plants to get the heating and use the heat for the chemical processes that are required or for agriculture. Well, it's not something that is happening overnight. They don't have access to sea, so they cannot get liquefied natural gas simply, and so it would be very difficult thing for Serbia if Russian gas was suddenly stopped. And Serbia is an interconnector as well. The gas supplies run through Serbia also to Bosnia and Herzegovina. So if those are stopped, much of Bosnia will be shut down as well.
Yes, and it's not only in gas but in oil as well, because NIS, Serbian company, also exports much of its quantities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where it has its oil pumps basically everywhere. So it's also a question of the region. And I would argue that by doing this, the pressure is not only put on Serbia, but also in Republika Srpska and on its leadership, if I may say former leadership now, because it was exceptionally pro-Russian oriented in the eyes of the Westerners. So it may be killing two birds with one stone. That kind of situation.
As you said, probably US is basically playing a very strong hand, forcing out Russian energy interests in Europe and very much replacing it via American interest.
Yes, with their more expensive LNG.
Yes,
and industry that is blooming. So somewhere I read the article that basically these LNG terminals are like growing as a mushrooms everywhere around the world, because it's it's not a new thing, but it's exponentially exploding in demand for LNG, precisely because of these issues. But to export the oil and gas, it's much easier through the pipelines, through the already existing infrastructure. So I would paraphrase Hungarian Prime Minister when he said, this is an issue of geography, not of politics. So basically, if you are a landlocked country like Serbia or like Hungary or like Slovakia, it's very difficult to cut already existing infrastructure and just all of a sudden, create a new one. It's not possible. So either you have an access to the sea, or you rely on others around you and on their goodwill, and basically energy import would get much more expensive, and that's not sustainable, not even in the short term. So transporting it via river in maybe some oil tankers or something like that would be a short-term solution to improve quantities of oil basically in a country, and that could be one of the solutions for Serbia, because they basically will run out of oil in following weeks. And what's the official estimation is that on 25th of November, the main Serbian oil refinery in Pančevo, it will cease to operate, to work, because it basically has no crude oil to refine. And that's a huge issue, because a lot of people work there, a lot of families to feed, and what will state do? On the other hand, state officials often point out that, we have a very good cooperation with Russians and very good communication. They are ready to solve this issue and these kind of things, but realities show differently. So they're often encouraging us to do the right thing, to stay calm, to stay put, to wait, and they will somehow figure it out. But at the moment, sanctions are in place after being postponed many times. So since January, they have been postponed and finally entered into force on 9th of October in the morning. And basically 9th of October was, D-Day for the Serbian energy crisis, which is yet to reveal itself.
The Americans have a very strong hand. We can see it also regarding Slovakia, regarding Hungary, and sanctions on Lukoil, that their local refineries are not able to process the crude which they are designed to process. And well, it's not going to be easy to find a new source of the crude, because there would probably need to be a big investment to retool the refineries for a new source of crude, and this is all up in the air what's gonna happen. But yes, the Americans, by putting pressure on Russia, are putting pressure on a lot of countries and their very export-focused economies, such as Slovakia, Hungary, Serbia, and well, basically the whole region. Probably the strategy we are talking mainly about Serbia, was that to somehow wait it out. That let's wait for a couple of years. Maybe these things will disappear. Ukrainians will make peace with Russians, and Americans will do their thing kind of with Russians, and things will come back to normal. Well, they did not, and maybe it will not be better for coming years. Who knows how many years? Well, as you said, US has imposed sanctions on NIS in January. They applied waivers to those sanctions. So basically, like raising a finger, like warning finger to Serbia, do something about it.
Yeah.
Well, they did not. And now the sanctions are in full force, and they are making their very nasty effect.
Actually,
what are the options? What can Serbia do?
There was one option, and it's already used, but it's proven not to be useful. Gazprom Neft made some move in August, and I see it as a move to resolve this issue, but it was not resolved. So basically what Gazprom did is that they transferred 11% of their shares to their subsidiary Intelligence. So it's St. Petersburg company, basically dealing with, I think, finances and these kind of things. So it's, again, their subsidiary, but they hope that the sanctions won't take place if they basically diversify their shares within the company. So in this way, the Russians don't have, the Gazprom Neft doesn't have more than 50% of the votes, but de facto they do have with their subsidiary company. This was not proven useful, not as a solution, and nevertheless US still imposed sanctions, as it warned many times before. As you point out, strategy to wait, it was very bad strategy. If one could observe everything what happened since January to October, basically it was only talking that okay, in 3 months there will be sanctions. Okay, then they again got postponed, and again in 3 months there will be sanctions. And just like you said, it's like Americans are waving their finger and warning, but nobody's listening. So that's why I think they announced that in September there will be no new postponement, and on October the 1st the sanctions will take place. Swiftly before that, Vučić met with Rubio, State Secretary of the US, and sanctions were postponed again, but only for 8 days, which means that on October 9th in the morning, the sanctions will take place. However, I have a feeling that within Serbian society and decision makers, they couldn't believe that something like this will happen even on October 9th, as the US said. But nevertheless, it did happen. And again, I'm strongly convinced that Serbia still doesn't have any solution. Serbian authorities are somewhat relying on some solution that Russians can offer or US can offer, and there were some rumors that Russians are willing to let US origin oil to basically occupy the market, or even to sell some shares to the US companies, but these were rumors. I don't think that's possible given the current situation. Why would the US then impose sanctions? Why would Russia decide to sell to the US companies and not to the Serbian companies? Because that's the main issues. Serbian government offered to buy it out, not officially, but again, rumors. But it's easiest move, because if you transfer this 11% that currently this intelligence company holds, if you transfer it to the money, to the dollars, you get somewhere around 120 million US dollars according to the last known share prices, which is pennies, which is, any like mid-sized company could afford it, and especially Serbian government could afford it to regain its energy sovereignty, basically. But that did not take place because Russians are strongly opposed to that. So I'm not sure if there is any other possibility for other companies in the region to be involved in this problem solving. But one thing is certain, the Russians have leverage in this situation, so they can say we want to sell it or not. And it's also important to point out that this situation doesn't benefit Russians, not because of the revenues or anything like this, or because of the disaster of this company, not because of that per se, but because of the issues that it internally creates in Serbia and the sentiments about the Russians that they are not, they do not want to help Serbia by resolving this issue. So they need to maintain their positive image about Serbia's big brother, if I may call that, and they basically need to resolve this issue somehow. It's difficult to see how it will end. Some sort of compromise needs to come out of it, but it seems that Americans aren't even happy with the compromise. They just, from what I could read, they just desire complete annihilation of Russia in energy sector on the Balkans and on Serbia as well. So, and that's followed with a more wider sanctions on Lukoil, for example, where also Lukoil has some share in the market, Serbian energy market, but it's a minor issue because already some other company from Cyprus bought Lukoil Serbia. So it's a resolvable issue. It's not resolvable so easy for example, Bulgaria, because they have refinery which is under Lukoil control and it's much more complicated. But for Serbia, it was definitely a solution. What is also an issue here is that it's a unique situation. I couldn't find any precedent on this. I could find only some companies, for example, Indian companies that also have dealt with the Russians and are under the sanctions. I also found some short-term solutions, but it's only a logistical and operational question, technical questions. So, for example, I don't know if people know this, but if you are under US sanctions, you cannot pay by your Visa or MasterCard on petrol stations. So you must use cash or some other payment method. So basically, then this SWIFT payment system is banned. You cannot do that. And citizens feel it every day. For example, when they go to get their diesel or petrol, never mind, yes, and they cannot pay.
We don't realize it, but yes, because US sanctions mean that no entity based in US cannot make any sort of trade with this company. And yes, the card companies which issue all of our credit cards are based in the US. Yes, indeed. So yes, you will not be able to pay.
And it's not only that, it's just to fill that up. It's also with the other financial institutions. So, for example, European banks, if one company, for example, NIS in Serbia, is under the sanctions, US sanctions, no other company dares to do business with that company in any way. So basically either providing loans or giving any financial services or advisory service or anything, basically, because that company is isolated. So NIS right now is isolated, and the only banks that want to cooperate with NIS are domestic Serbian banks, which are actually, one is state-owned and one is privately owned. But already these two companies have received threat from the US Treasury Department that they will also be a subject of sanctions.
Secondary sanctions.
Yes, if this continues. So no sane leadership of the one company would ever want to have cooperation with company that is under the sanctions. So it's not only about the payments and these kind of things. Basically now the NIS is bleeding and it's very difficult to repair it. And while we were talking about the solutions, I just briefly mentioned and my thought went away, but now it returned. So one very short-term solution would be, and it was pointed out by Hungarian foreign minister, that Hungary would help Serbia given the good political relationship. One solution would be to transport oil from Százhalombatta. It's like the biggest Hungarian refinery near to Budapest, and it could be transport the excess amount of oil to Serbia via Danube River. And logistically speaking, it would be possible. And I already read some local news in Serbia that some rich businessmen are buying this oil. It's not oil tanker, but like these small oil barges, or I don't know how they are called in English. So it was in motion. But what happened? This oil refinery in Hungary got under the fire. So, and it's very, very strange situation. Some even linked it with fire in a Romanian refinery, which happened basically several hours before or one day before that. I'm not sure. But it's not going too many into conspiracy theories, who did it and why. According to some estimates, that crippled the ability of this refinery to work by 40% in Hungary, which basically means that, okay, now Hungarian oil refineries under some kind of a crisis. I'm not sure how big of that crisis is, but still it's a crisis, so they cannot actually export the excess oil. And again, that means a problem for Serbia as well, and problem for the other countries that it supplies. For example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, a large amount of oil go to Bosnia and Herzegovina via Serbia. So once again, this short-term solution could work before the fire in Hungarian oil refinery, but now it cannot work.
And is it possible that Serbia would nationalize the company or nationalize at least it temporarily or part of the ownership structure?
That's what I was saving for an end, because as Serbian president pointed it out, that would be a last resort. So last possible mean if everything fails, we will use this method. But also he never explicitly said we will use it, but he just said it's a last resort. I don't want to talk about it. But what is important is that in previous 2 weeks, the rhetoric has changed. And I saw that president, being de facto leader of the country, is a bit sick of the Russians for multiple reasons. One of the reasons is that Serbia waited for a gas contract to be renewed on a long-term basis from Russia. Serbia waited, I think, from April, so for this contract to be renewed. But the Russians were postponing it always. And finally, they said in October, okay, we will renew this contract, but only until the New Year's, so until 31st of December, which basically means that if Russians want to do it, they could stop gas supply to Serbia from January the 1st, in the middle of the winter, which would be devastating for Serbia as a small country. And which also has another implication: if Serbia dares to nationalize NIS as an oil company, strategic company, Russia would retaliate. They would just simply not basically sell any more gas, natural gas, to Serbia, which creates additional new set of the problems. However, I told that there have been something that is in motion, a change of rhetoric. Vučić said that in last week. He said that we will wait for 1 or 2 weeks. If nothing happens, so if they don't come up with proposal, we will take matter into our own hands. What that means, that's left for interpretation, but there is only one thing Serbia can do, that's nationalizing this company, which would have huge consequences for Serbian-Russian relationship, which I think no government in Serbia can afford, given the strong historical and cultural ties and the strong support of basically Serbian public opinion towards Russia. So I think this is highly unlikely to happen. But again, President made an official statement that something will happen in the next 2 weeks. So hopefully by the time this interview gets out, there will be no spoiler and the government will not be faster to react. But yes, if it happens, let it be so. The only important thing is that all sides come to an agreement.
I very much hope so. Well, Serbs have always been able diplomatically or somewhere behind closed doors to pretty well manage the relationship between the great powers or middle powers or regional powers, either for their benefit or at least not to end up on the bad side of anyone. So let's hope this will be the same kind of story. Well, nationalization, it brings loads of bilateral issues. Obviously, with Russia, it would destroy the relationship with other Russian companies as well. When Russia, a lot is state-owned, or maybe not directly, but practically state-owned. So this would destroy the relationship between the two countries. And I think somewhere down the line, it will come to court. The Russians would sue Serbia for the loss of profit or something along that lines, and Serbia would pay heavily for it sometime later.
That's wild guessing. If it comes to that, hopefully it won't. However, one thing I forgot to mention is that it's important that Vučić many times repeated that Americans forced Serbian authorities to nationalize as a solution. So he emphasized that it was the American idea that, okay, you either have two options, either we sanction you or you nationalize it. In his own words, Vučić said that he's never going to do it. But he said many things that he's never going to do them, but he still does it. So that remains an open question. We'll follow up and hopefully it would resolve without major diplomatic concussions, which would be beneficial for the US and Europe, especially for the Serbian EU pathway. It would be much beneficial to give up any kind of positive relationship with Russia. But again, knowing the Serbian mentality and knowing the Serbian politics, it would be very difficult to distance itself from Russian influence.
Well, these are the unfortunate results of very unfortunate times when you have a war in your immediate neighborhood. We are experiencing, all of us, this for the first time in our generation, and we can only hope for the best and manage the damage control. First, in Serbia, the risk of damage is pretty significant.
Yes. Among other crises that is Serbia dealing with right now, as we talked in previous podcasts about protests, some internal issues, political issues in Serbia, also external issues with international relations, with the European Union pathway, accession, and so on and so forth. So Serbia is dealing with a lot. I would say Serbian government at the moment, so because they are the ones responsible and the decision makers. They have a lot on their mind. They didn't need this kind of situation, but they ended up in it. It is additionally making it worse is the European Union new proposed laws about banning Russian energy imports by 2028, if I'm not mistaken. So totally banning it, it would be very difficult. Maybe there will be a solution to find some exemptions because Serbia is not in the EU. It only has Bulgaria as a transit country, and Bulgaria can offer transit of that energy, but of gas, natural gas, but it still remains an open question for European decision makers and to see how strong Serbian lobby is in Brussels and in Washington, D.C.
I can say, wish us all luck. Thank you, Filip, very much for coming to yet another of our episodes and for such an in-depth discussion, this time on a completely different topic. Well, the issue is we do these discussions and these are long-term issues, so, well, we will have to do follow-up episodes on both of them in a couple of months' time, maybe next year, to see how they turned out, or do something completely else and totally interesting.
I would be happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you for appearing, and goodbye, everyone.